This podcast is for informational and educational purposes only. It is not medical care or advice. Clinicians should rely on their own medical judgments when advising their patients. Patients in need of medical care should consult their personal care provider. It is an issue so many are facing these days, feelings of grief and loss after being diagnosed or having a loved one diagnosed with dementia. Hi, I'm Tonya Caruso. Welcome to this UPMC HealthBeat podcast. And joining us right now is Elizabeth Schandelmeier. She is a bereavement coordinator and counselor with UPMC Family Hospice. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So many families are facing this, and it's become such a topic. There's actually a term for it now, twilight grief. Tell me what that means.
Well, twilight grief is actually something that has come out of some of the previous discussions that we've had. We've talked about folks living with chronic illness and from the time sort of diagnosis through end of life, and that can be a period of years, long years. And described it before as this sort of gray area, but I realized that it's not really gray. It's not gray, it's not flat. It's actually full of a lot of life. And things are changing and shifting through that time, but there's lots of moments of beauty and joy. So while it can be melancholy knowing that the person that you're caring for, that their daylight is starting to fade, it's also still a period of time when you can appreciate the moments of sort of little magical bits that can come up.
So that sounds so hopeful to hear you say that, but I'm thinking at the beginning of a diagnosis, so much is going to change, and so much does change, not only for the individual, but for their families. And so talk about what that might look like.
Indeed. Well, there's a lot of things that have to be taken care of. And oftentimes with a dementia diagnosis, it begins after a person has recognized that, whether it's the person themselves or the family around them, that they're perhaps being a little bit more forgetful than they had been before, or not quite able to take care of themselves in the same way that they might have been able to before. And so you go and sort of get things checked out, and then you have this diagnosis, and what do you do with that from there? It's not always something that you have to do a whole lot about at the beginning, but over time, as a person, as their capabilities begin to fade, there can be a lot of changes that have to happen in terms of taking care of this person and making sure that they're safe. Safety is always the priority, and so creating a situation, whether it's caring for them at home or finding the right placement for them, these are things that can lead to a lot of chaos and turmoil in a family.
Chaos and turmoil, not just the emotional toll of knowing that you need to face this, but also in the day-to-day finances. If you have to leave a job or because you're the person diagnosed, or now you need to be home to care for this person, lots of stressors there as well.
Absolutely. Perhaps you were just about to receive that big promotion at work, and now you're needing to decide whether or not do you continue with your career, or do you give up your job altogether to stay home and care for another person. Maybe you're about to retire, and you and your spouse were going to take a world trip, and now all of a sudden you find that you don't really have the kinds of freedoms that you had before. So your own aspirations, if you're having to give up your work, your finances are definitely impacted. And I don't know a whole lot of people who can simply give up work and not have to figure out how to accommodate that loss of finances. So there's just a lot of areas in people's lives where their personal freedom, their aspirations, their ideas, their hopes for their own future, as well as the future of the person with dementia, that those things shift and change.
We have been doing this whole series on grief and loss, and you always say it's important to normalize it. Is that the starting point? I mean, what do you say to people about the starting point if you're dealing with this in your family? How do you get to those points where there are all these bright spots?
Well, the bright spots happen naturally. You just have to be open to them. It is a matter of I think also being able to find language to talk about the experience that you're having. We're so afraid of using the word grief when we're talking about a person who's living and who will have a long time to live, perhaps. So it's really not about sort of anticipatory grief, which we've talked about before, which is when you're anticipating a person's death. We're not necessarily anticipating their death. It may be, 5-10 years from this point. And so it is beginning to recognize the ways in which your life is changing, your relationship is changing, your identity is changing, and being okay with the idea that it can both be changing and be okay at the same time. A lot of times we use the word but instead of and we might say things like, well, I'm really happy to be taking care of my mother, but it really is hard. And the truth is that it's both of those things. And this is what makes grief, in my opinion, a fairly unique experience, human experience, where it's all of the different emotions wrapped up. And we tend to want to reject the ones that feel negative because we wonder what that means about ourselves as a person. If I'm a person, if I say I'm overwhelmed by caring for my mother, what kind of daughter am I? Well, you're a wonderful daughter. You're there. You're overwhelmed. It's okay. It's just a feeling. But being able to accept those parts of yourself, of the person who's changing, and of your changing circumstances as well, I think that helps to open space to finding the moments of joy and beauty.
And so how important is it, especially as a caretaker, to talk to someone? What sort of things do you want them to be thinking about?
They really do need to be thinking about themselves because the person who they're caring for, they are at the center. They will get the care that they need. They have the professionals, they have their medical team, they have you. And so really what gets forgotten is the caretaker themselves. And a lot of times they forget that they're important too, and that their health and well-being is important, both as a function of being a caretaker. You need to be healthy in order to take care of another person, but also because they matter. And just because you are giving up certain parts of your life doesn't mean you cease to be an important human being. One thing I really like to remind people is that self-care is not the same as self-improvement. So when we're moving through, this sort of idea of self-care, so often people set these goals for themselves that may or may not be realistic.
Like what's an example?
Going to the gym 5 days a week, and I'm going to, get on the treadmill and make sure that, that I'm healthy. Well, not that that's not a great goal, of course. If you can do that, absolutely. Most people probably are not in a position to be able to make such a large commitment. Plus, a part of the issue is the fact that you've made this sort of commitment. It's one in which you're setting yourself up to fail. And you don't need any more to feel bad about when you're in this situation. So I would pull that back, and I would ask a person who comes up with that kind of goal, what exactly are you trying to achieve? What is it about going to the gym 5 days a week and getting on the treadmill that's actually important? A lot of times it'll be something quite simple. Somebody might say, well, it's a time when I get to just be by myself for an hour. I get to be outside of the house for an hour or 45 minutes. It makes my body feel good. And so we can reshape and reframe that, this sort of self-improvement activity into self-care. And we can say, well, the self-care is actually just maybe getting a half an hour to do your own thing in a day. And, so that can be stepping outside for a walk around the block, or it can be, closing the door to your bedroom and watching your favorite program. So once you get to sort of the heart of what the self-improvement is about, you typically have this beautiful little nugget of self-care that's a little bit more manageable.
And we have discussed this before. Lots of times caretakers will say, I don't even have 5 minutes to take care of myself because of everything I'm dealing with. But you say there are actually lots of 5-minute self-care things that folks can do.
And they're really fun. This was sort of a new concept for me because I've been thinking about so much about how hard it is to practice self-care at home. And so I started looking around, and it's little things that make us happy. So maybe you're painting your fingernails or even clipping your toenails. I mean, that is something that so many of us never get a chance to do. So you set aside a little bit of time to do that. Bringing music into your life, listening to your favorite song, sing to your favorite song. That's a 3-minute activity there. Anything that you could bring a little bit of art or beauty, laughter. Maybe when we're our friends are asking us, what can we do? What can we do? You can tell them, you know what, send me something funny every day. Don't expect a response, because I don't want to have a conversation. But just send me a funny little saying or a meme or something inspirational, something I can just open my phone and look at it. Or maybe even look for some funny podcasts. Find a way to just bring a little bit of levity to your life. Sometimes it's just a matter of taking a shower. Maybe you add an extra 2 or 3 minutes to that shower just to stand there and take some deep breaths. Maybe you have a good cry. Actually, crying
can be self-care?
It absolutely is self-care. When we cry, we produce all kinds of hormones in our body that are self-soothing. So it actually feels really good. It's a really nice way of calming ourselves down. But it's also a nice way of acknowledging that the work that we're doing is hard and that it takes a toll. And so we can even grieve for ourselves a little bit that way. But yeah, tears are really quite healthy.
There will be lots of times that tears might be it. There are also some physical things that can come along with grief and loss.
Without question, especially when you're a care partner in this sort of long-term, as I said, twilight grief zone, where you're probably not taking care of yourself in the way that you used to. You're prioritizing the meals and the food for the person that you're caring for. Perhaps they need to have a pureed diet, for example, or perhaps their food intake is limited, and so you limit your own food. Or perhaps they have so many doctor's appointments that you never get to go in for your own. So your dental health, your personal health, checking out that little bump on your head and seeing what that is, the way you eat, the way you move your body, hydrating, drinking water, these simple things, remembering to breathe. Even the most basic parts of keeping a healthy body are often put to the side to prioritize the person that they're caring for.
Right, and we've talked about before how there's not a beginning and an end to grief, that it's always there, and it's like this. Do you find that when you're working with families, are families surprised that there are joyful moments in this?
Absolutely, and this is, I think, a part of this whole idea of the twilight, where there's just so much that's going on in there, and no one moment is the same as the next, and it's constantly changing, and it's marching towards this darkness, right, towards a space of end of life, but it's absolutely not there. And so I always just advise people, as long as you're in this in-between space, it's all about living life as much as you possibly can. And what we know about life is that it has wonderful moments, it has hard moments, it has funny moments, it has sad moments, and everything in between. So being able to be present with whatever it is that's right in front of you, whether it's funny to other people or not, and a lot of times people who are caretaking have what they describe to me as a dark sense of humor. But it is just being able to appreciate what is right there in front of you and doing with it whatever you can. So in the hospital, if there's a moment that you can laugh about something, about anything, absolutely. It doesn't matter what the folks out in the hallway think. What you know is that you're supporting yourself, you're supporting probably your family, and probably even the person that you're laughing with. Whether they know what that thing is or not, it doesn't matter. We know that laughing feels good.
Is there a right or wrong way to have the conversation if you're the person who's diagnosed, or if you're the caregiver and you get this diagnosis and you're sort of like, we're in there for the long haul now? And if, one side in particular, one party in particular doesn't really want to talk about it, what are ways to start that conversation?
Well, when we're talking about dementia, there's certain, it's a little bit different than other kinds of disease processes because we're talking about a disease of the brain. And so the person who is experiencing dementia, their health will be constantly changing. And so what they could maybe understand one day may or may not be something that they can understand the next day. I really advise people to be super gentle with their impression of what another person is capable of because, again, it could be changing on a daily basis. The changes tend to be sort of like adding a feather to the pile. They may be really small, they may seem insignificant, but eventually that pile gets to be pretty big. And so it can be very surprising one day to realize that you have this great big pile of feathers because you've just been sort of plucking them one by one. So when you're speaking with a person and talking and making these kinds of decisions, you certainly want to include them as much as possible with the understanding that they may or may not really be fully capable of making good, safe decisions for themselves. And people are often confused about if a person with dementia is agreeable or not agreeable to this or that. Are they being difficult? Are they understanding what's going on? It's not always just the information that's being shared. It's also the inability to process it in their brain and to make sense of it and to continue to process that over time. If that ability has been lost, then they really need your help in making decisions that are, as far as you know, in line with what they would like for their life to look like. And to support that, knowing that they may or may not really have the capacity to make those decisions for themselves. So you have to be a little bit careful with that. I suggest that people meet them where they are and in that moment, because it may change.
How important, I should say, to have a support network around you? Very
important. If that is something that you can manage to build before, during, after, at any time, very, very important. Being a caregiver can be a very, very lonely job. You can feel very isolated and unappreciated and unseen, unheard, and completely invisible. Very few people know that caretaking is a 24-hour day, 7-day-a-week job. And without letting people know what you're going through, they'll just assume that you just don't want to go out to lunch with them anymore, or you just don't want to see them to meet for the movies. So really it's sort of on you to help people understand the limits that you have and how those limits are actually changing through time, and to sort of bring them in and invite them to help you in different kinds of ways. Whether it's, again, sending a little funny thing every day, or perhaps, coming in and sitting so that you can go take a half-an-hour shower or sit in the bathroom with the door locked, whatever it is, that works for you.
Yeah, so if someone is listening to this or watching this and they are thinking, I'm in this situation, it might do me some good to talk to someone about this, what's the best way, do you think, or someone should go about finding someone to talk to?
Sure. It's really wonderful because right now there's just an explosion of information, but also support. Certainly, I always think talking to a counselor is a great thing, but probably even better than that is talking in a group, if that's something that you're comfortable with, because what these groups tend to be about is just sharing the experience. And what you find is that caretakers tend to have very similar experiences, and so it's a group of people who will understand what you're going through. You don't have to worry about explaining. You don't have to worry about justifying. You don't have to worry about being judged, because you're all going through it together. And so there's lots of organizations now that are sort of popping up and forming to support people who caregive.
What do you want to say to folks about resources that are out there and just about what they should be thinking about heading into after getting a diagnosis like this?
I think some of the things that I would like for people to know is that the situation, first of all and foremost, is nobody's fault. And even though it might be frustrating at times or lonely, these are things that unfortunately happen. So when behaviors start changing, or somebody's forgetful, or they can't remember where they put their keys for the 1,000th time, just remembering that it's not their fault, that they're not simply not paying attention to you. And it's also not your fault for being frustrated, because it is really annoying to have somebody ask you the same question 1,000 times. And so, over time, it is about the process of figuring out how can I, wrap my mind around the magnitude of change that's happening and be in it in a way that allows me to let go of the frustration and maybe find it a little bit funny after the 100th time. So reframing your own perspective of your own experience. But also in terms of support, everybody should know about the Area Agency on Aging. So this is a government agency that exists in every county of Pennsylvania. And so each one is local to each county. But they have incredible programs, and they even have programs that will allow you to become a paid caregiver in your own home. So for family members and things like that. So if your finances have been impacted, that being able to receive compensation for the time that you spend can be a real lifesaver, or a house saver, or a car saver. Right. And for those folks who feel like, well, I'm doing this out of love, I feel guilty about asking for money for it, don't. This is what that money is for. And so please call the Area Agency on Aging and ask about the variety of programs, because not only are they paid giver, but also they may have different sorts of resources. For example, somebody to help with shopping, or perhaps light cleaning, or even just to come and sit and
some respite.
Some respite, exactly. So that's a very, very valuable resource. There's a wonderful group called Dementia Friendly Pennsylvania. They do great work. They're doing a series of webinars, and they talk about all kinds of things that we may or may not even begin to think about. Things like, for example, dementia and gun safety, or dementia and sexuality. So topics that may or may not be comfortable to talk about. These folks are bringing together experts to really talk about the hard things. And so that's a great resource. Of course, UPMC Senior Services has lots and lots and lots and lots of things that can be accessed. AARP, American Association for Retired People, they do a tremendous amount of work in this area. There's a program in Pittsburgh called Age Well. There's another one called Hope Cares that's very interesting. They offer a lot of respite, and actually I think they do offer counseling and other types of services that are specifically for caregivers. So once you start looking for these kinds of things, I think folks will find that they're pretty abundant, actually.
Well, Elizabeth Schandelmeier, as always, some great information. We thank you so much for coming in and spending time with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure.
You're welcome. I'm Tonya Caruso. Thank you for joining us. This is UPMC HealthBeat.